Hi folks, this is Jason and hope you are okay today. We're looking at the scholarship of Richard Bauckham, and we're looking at his lectures and his book, which is called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And so we're looking at his scholarship and some of the things that he said in his lectures, and I hope this will stimulate you to go and read some of Balcom's work. If you type in Richard Balcom, uh, and you'll be stimulated and blessed and encouraged. So let's come before the Lord. Father God, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for your love and your grace. We give you the praise, we give you the glory and the honor. And Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for these blessings. And Father, we give you the praise, we give you the glory. And Father, I pray the thoughts that I share today would be a blessing and a help to people. I ask this, Lord, in your name. Amen. Okay, the exercise of this video is just to open your mind a little bit to the scholarship that's around today on the study of the historical Jesus, and especially in the area of the four Gospels. Richard Bauckham has done 4 lectures at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. If you type in YouTube the Gospels as history, Richard Bauckham or Bauckham, and there you will find one of his lectures, and you'll be able to get other lectures as well. So these are my notes on his lectures, and then also my notes on his book. I'm just going to share what I think. I've been studying the historical Jesus studies in more and more depth, and I'm continually reading other scholars, reading his work again and again. So it's a continual reflection. I've done these notes before, but I'm going to be saying new things that you've not heard before, giving you new thoughts, because I've been studying more and have wider experience than I did a few months ago. So I just hope that this will be an encouragement to you and a blessing to you. First of all, in the first lecture, Bauckham, however you want to pronounce it, he mentions that in the 20th century, scholars generally denied that the Gospels were not biography. But he states now in the scholarly world that's changed. Academics have begun to see that actually the Gospels are ancient biography. So there's been a sea change. So I'm just looking at my notes. So in his lecture he talks about the various kind of biographies that were in the first century. There were political biographies. He talks about the writings of Plutarch. He talks about intellectual biographies, short biographies in the ancient world. He talks about the historiography and writing of various ancient historians, about how and why they wrote. How and why they wrote history. And then in his lecture he then talks about how the Gospels have to be seen in the context, how ancient historians wrote. How did they write history? What were their methods? What were their purpose? How did they write biography? What were their methods? What were their purpose? And so in his lecture, he talks quite a bit about this, and then says when we're looking at the Gospels, we have to understand these literary productions in the first century context of how history was written. He contends in his lectures that the Gospels were written in living memory, that there were still eyewitnesses living. He talks about history is about fact and meaning. There is fact and interpretation. And he believes that if you look at the Gospels, you can find traces of eyewitness material. Just looking at my notes. Okay, I could go on quite a lot about these lectures. I find them fascinating. I could talk about. He goes into the history of history, looking at historians over the years. He talks about history from below in the 1960s. He talks about historians such as E.P. Thomas, 1960, early classic historians of 1963. The history of above, which is the history of the elite. And basically he's saying that throughout history there have been a concentration, that there have been different styles of history where historians have concentrated on certain things. So for example, some historians have concentrated on the history of nations, history of a variety of perspectives in history. And this is important because it helps us to define what actually is the methodology of the history of the Gospels, and it seems to be that the Gospels were ahead of the time, because prior to the Gospels, 4 Gospels being written, history was generally about the big hitters, the generals, the empire, etc. If you look at right up until Voltaire, Voltaire then writes about ordinary people. But that was a big sea shift, because most historians throughout history concentrated on either the big famous people or the empire. The 4 Gospels seem to concentrate on most people that are not important, which is a completely different historical method, which it wasn't until Voltaire discovered or made popular. So the Gospels predate Voltaire by many hundreds of years. I thought that was an interesting thought. And I think because I've got more material written down, I've got such a lot of notes on his lectures. In an essay of his, just get the essay. In an essay of his on the authenticity of apostolic eyewitness in the New Testament, talks about how the Gospels were written around the circle of people who knew Jesus and based on apostolic teaching. The form critics saw the Gospels as folk literature, but failed to realize that these kind of oral traditions are cultural specific, and so failed to pick sort of kind of false criteria of understanding the Gospels. So in quotes, oral tradition, culturally specific. Quote again, Bultmann School too generalistic. He asked the question in his essay, why the names? You get names in Mark chapter 6 verse 3, Mark 10:46, Luke 24:18. And so he asked that question, well, why the detailed names in the Gospels? He talks about a various phenomenon in ancient literature of ancient historiography. There were methodologies which historians used as material. They would have the inclusion, which was a common phenomenon in ancient literature, a sort of structure in which a passage had a beginning and an end with corresponding material, but indicated who the eyewitness was behind the material that they were writing. And he says that this kind of first century style of historiography was in the four Gospels. So then he writes, there are no longer good reasons for supposing that the Gospel traditions passed through a lengthy process of oral transmission in the early Christian communities. He writes, on the contrary, it is most plausible to think of the eyewitnesses as living and active, well known throughout the Christian movement down to the time when the Gospels, page 8. Page 9. As I have already stated, and probably most Gospel scholars now agree, the literary genre to which the four Gospels belong is the ancient genre of biography. He goes on, what we have in the four Gospels, in my view, is good access to the apostolic testimony about Jesus. So that's what he has to say there in an article or an essay that he actually wrote. And now we're going to get into his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and then we're going to this, because my notes are set out more clearly here, I can talk more freely. I'm sorry I've not been as free in my conversation, but here I can give much more critical assessment now because I've got clearer notes. The more available for reflecting on. The other notes on the lectures are higgledy-piggledy, they're all over the place. These notes are set out in neat so I can look at them and process them a lot better. So, okay, we're going to get into depth now and analyze some of the thoughts from Richard Balcombe, and then we're going to go into much detail here now. Okay. So this is from the book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the Gospels as Eyewitness Testimony, Richard Balcombe, 2006, Erdman. On page 3 it says, all history, meaning all that history is right, all historiography is inextricable combination of fact and interpretation, the empirical observable, and the invited or constructed meaning. I think that is a very profound statement that Richard Barkham makes there, and I'm quite impressed with this statement there. I've been reading a book on the history of history. I've been reading about the historian Herodotus and many ancient. In my own thinking, I have come to that conclusion that history is a matter of fact and interpretation. And very often in debates between atheists and Christians, the discussion is about so-called facts. There's very little discussion about interpretation and about how interpretation is dovetailing into our understanding of the facts. And I think that's a beautiful statement by Richard Barkham. I really do. And that shows his knowledge of history. You see, Richard Barkham is a theologian, but he is also a historian. He's a trained historian, and you can see that through that statement. That statement shows a mature thinker in historiography. He writes, by comparison with the Gospels, any Jesus by the quest cannot fail to be reductionistic from the perspective of Christian theology. I think that's quite true. I think any historian or theologian or anybody who is going to study historical Jesus studies from a scholarly perspective in the academic world, there will be a reductionist influence. In the 19th century, when many books were written about Jesus, Renan and Strauss, they were very reductionistic, i.e. they didn't believe in the supernatural. But I'm not too sure that it has to be reductionistic, because I do think that presuppositions that we bring to history and how we use them need to be questioned. And I would say that the Christian presuppositions are consistent and valid presuppositions. And so on two levels, I think that the desire to study data and the looking at presupposition does not necessarily mean your historiography has to be reductionistic. However, it is necessarily reductionistic in today's academic climate, but it doesn't have to be so. Page 4. By comparison with the Gospels, any Jesus reconstructed by the quest cannot fail to be reductionistic from the perspective of Christian facts and theology. Yes, but it doesn't have to be. I think methodology, presuppositions need to be challenged. And I think a Christian understanding of history is far superior than a secular understanding of history, and gives a good foundation for historical inquiry. Page 4. Trusting testimony is not irrational act of faith that leaves critical rationality aside. It is, on the contrary, the rationally appropriate way of responding to authentic testimony. I think there is a debate that needs to be had and would be an interesting debate and discussion, and I think perhaps a book needs to be written on it in more depth. And that is to say, what is the philosophical and epistemological implications of historical testimony? I think that what we can know of the past depends on a number of factors, but one of them is whether the testimony that we're investigating is authentic or not. I think that knowledge generally is based on testimony. Scientific experiment is based on testimony in the sense that the community of scientists testify to the work of a particular scientist as being accurate. So testimony is by its nature part of human knowledge. Whether you can demarcate historical testimony as being less superior than scientific testimony, that's a moot question. But the point is that testimony is the foundation or part of a central part of. And if that's the case, then what are the implications of some historical situation where testimony is given and it's good testimony? How do we respond to that? Page 5. It is true that a powerful trend in modern development of critical historical philosophy finds trusting testimony a stumbling block in the way of the historian's autonomous access to that she or he can verify independently, but it is also a rather neglected fact that all history, like all knowledge, relies on testimony. Page 5. So he's really challenging historians and thinkers to recognize the fact that you can't get away from testimony if you're going to do history. We must recognize that, historically speaking, testimony is a unique and uniquely valuable means of access to reality. You know something, I do think he's correct there, and I do think that this playing down of testimony in epistemology, it's just silly. Testimony is is at the heart of our experience of human beings, and it's no good pretending that it isn't. In quote, he writes, testimony offers us, I wish to suggest, both a reputable historiography for reading the Gospels as history, and also a theological method for understanding the Gospels as entirely appropriate means of access to the historical reality of Jesus. Again, I completely concur with what Richard Bauckham is saying here. Completely. Again, I do think that historians, theologians, philosophers just underplay the role of testimony in our knowledge and in the knowledge of history, and is an appropriate method for theological reflection. He writes, this is the assumption that the traditions about Jesus, his acts and his words passed through a long process of oral tradition in the early Christian communities and reached the writers of the Gospels only at a late stage of the process. Page 6. He's talking here about form criticism, the idea that Christianity developed over a long period of time, and various communities edited the story and embellished the story of the life of Jesus, mythological. Page 7. He quotes Vincent Taylor, if form critics are right, the disciples must have been translated to heaven immediately after the resurrection. Page 7. I think what he's saying there is that he's striking a blow at form criticism. Form criticism had the idea, very simply, had the idea that that the Gospels developed through communities, and these communities got together over time and began to edit, change, modify, build in stories about Jesus, fabricate ideas about Jesus. But the key word is, quote, communities. And the quote here by Vincent Taylor, which Bauckham quotes in page 7, completely discounts that. If the form critics are right, notice this is really important, the disciples must have been translated to heaven immediately after the resurrection. So if we take this form critic perspective of Bultmann and his followers, that there were these communities who were editing and changing and developing the story of Jesus, it doesn't take into account the fact the way the culture was working at the time of Jesus. You see, he built key individuals around him like Peter, etc. And these would have been alive and managing, passing on the tradition. So they weren't just nameless communities, they were individual people who were the inner circle of Jesus' ministry, and they would have been around to supervise the passing on of the tradition about Jesus, which is a completely different way of looking at it from the form critics, and puts things in a whole new perspective, a new ball game in historical Jesus studies. Page 7. Now we went on to the point that eyewitness participants in the events of the gospel narratives did not go into permanent retreat, for at the heart they moved among the young Palestinian communities, and through preaching and fellowship their recollections were at the disposal of those who sought information. So basically he's striking a blow again against this form critic idea of these nebulous communities changing the story. Here he's saying no, there were these disciples, they knew Jesus and they just didn't run away, they were there and they were supervising the passing on of the information about Jesus. Martin Hengel said, he quotes Martin Hengel about how the memories of these disciples and about who Jesus was passed on through these specific kind of people. He talks about how Polybius, a ancient historian around about 200 BC, had a particular way of writing history, and that writing history was to get eyewitness material. If you read Polybius's writing, Polybius clearly states that if you're going to be a good historian, you have to go and get eyewitness material. Now, I think you have to be careful here. I think Balcom knows history quite well, knows historians quite well, but you do have to be careful not to generalize with these ancient historians. But Polybius did have a general belief that to be a historian, you had to go and try and get eyewitness material if you can. Now, writing, he wrote around about 200 BC. His writing became popular and was a model for historians in Jesus' day and after Jesus. Some of the Greek words for what Polybius used as seeing history as important and the way to write history. Some of these key Greek words were used by the Apostle Paul and others to indicate that they had a similar method or idea about history. That is to say, using eyewitness material. So I think we'll just read Luke chapter 1. We read, Most Honourable Theophilus, many people have written accounts about the events that took place among us. They used as their source material the reports circulating among us from the early disciples and other eyewitnesses of what God has done in fulfillment of his promises. Having carefully investigated all these accounts from the beginning, I have decided to write a careful summary for you to treasure you, to reassure you of the truth of all you were taught. So it's very clear in that writing that is very similar understanding of history as the ancient historian Polybius, who influenced first century historiography. Biersock says, having established the key role of eyewitness testimony in ancient historiography, Biersock argues that a similar role must have been played in the formation of the gospel tradition. This is Balcom on Bierskog, I think it is. Page 10. He goes, the gospel narratives are thus synthesis of history and story, of oral history and eyewitnesses, and a narrating process of an author. He quotes Bayer Skoggs, page 10. He writes, the ancient histories know that first-hand insider testimony gave access to truth that could not have been had otherwise. Though not thwarted, they were willing to trust their eyewitnesses informants for the sake of the unique access they gained to the truth of the events. So I think it's important. I really do think this, and this is really important, that if you're going to do historical Jesus story, the life of the Lord, then you've got to know what these ancient historians were writing, what they were thinking. And I do think that we as modern historians and modern writers and thinkers need to be challenged about the ancients' understanding of history. You see, they saw that testimony gave a unique access into a historical event. Now, I know that in modern times we've concentrated not just on grand narratives of history, but we've concentrated on minorities and individuals in our historiography. And so there is that kind of tacit recognition of the ancient thinking about history being ate by modern historians. But I do think, as historians and philosophers and theologians and thinkers, we just don't really grapple with the nature of the literature in the time of Jesus and after concerning how historians wrote. We really don't grapple with it. And it's good to see Richard Balcom do that. So Richard Balcom noticed various Greek words such as inquired, anikirinon. This was a Greek word that had a judicial context, and so history was seen by historians like Polybius and Lucian as giving a testimony that can stand up to scrutiny. He writes on page 14, the sources of oral historians are reminiscences. The source of an oral historian are reminiscences, hearsay, or eyewitness accounts about events and situations which are contemporary, that is, which occurred during the lifetime of the informants. This differs from oral tradition in that oral traditions are oral traditions are no longer contemporary. They have passed from mouth to mouth for a period beyond the lifetime of the informants. The two situations typically are very So I'll just stop there because I can't read my handwriting there, but basically what Barkham is saying, and I think this is borne out by the research of James Dunn as well, in his Hayes lectures that you can look at. But basically, the form critics basically said that the Gospels were basically oral tradition. Yeah, this oral tradition can be passed on from generation to generation and change. It's quite mythological in its development. But what Borkham is saying is, if you know, oral tradition is culturally specific, which I said earlier on in the video. And being culturally specific was based, there is a difference between oral tradition and being an oral historian. In the ancient world, in Jesus' time, in Jesus' area, there were oral historians. That is, people passing on the traditions, but in an oral historical way, making sure eyewitness accounts, reminiscences, and hearsay were passed on. Which is a completely radical different way of looking at it from the form critics. But here's the point. It's based on eyewitness accounts. It's a cultural specific understanding of the way people did history in the time of Jesus. Page 14. This makes the particular passage from Papias very precious evidence of the way in which gospel traditions were understood to be related to the eyewitnesses at the very time when our canonical gospels being written. I'll read that again. This makes the particular passage from Papias very precious evidence of the way in which gospel traditions were understood to be related to the eyewitnesses at the very time when the canonical gospels were being written. Page 14. So what he's saying there is, look, if you look at the historical context of when the Gospels were written, they were written in the context of oral historians rather than oral tradition. And oral historians is culturally, when we're talking about oral tradition of any sort, you have to be culturally specific. The point being here is this way of understanding history, and the reason why the Gospels wrote, i.e. trying to pass on the eyewitness testimony. All this shows us to be more critical of those scholars and thinkers who just said Christianity is a myth because it developed over time. The facts are, it doesn't take into consideration the nuanced historical context of the Gospels. And I think the problem that I have here, there's one or two issues that I have here now. Page 14 again. This makes the particular passage from Papias very precious evidence of the way in which the gospel traditions were understood and related to the eyewitnesses. I want to say one or two things here which are really important. I think it's very important to realize that we're dealing with very complex historical information, that it's not at all as easy to put all the pieces together in looking at the history. There are some complex, difficult issues to think about in that process. So, having said that, I think it's a bit simplistic of Richard Barkham to take a passage about Papias by Papias and to deduce a whole theory of ancient historiography and how that might dovetail into the Gospels. I think it's a part of the evidence. I think it's an interesting part and a good part of the evidence, but it has to be supplanted with other evidences wider afield. The significance of Papias is he's mentioned by Eusebius, and Eusebius mentions Papias, who said he knew Philip's daughters, that he was a guy who goes right back to the disciples or the apostles or people that they knew. And I think the problem with that is it can be a little bit simplistic, because if you read Eusebius, there are some tough questions to ask. For example, he says that Papias said that it was the elder John who wrote the Gospel of John and not John himself. So in the one hand, Barkham is taking historical information about Papias and deducing certain things, difficult questions as well. But the Papias passage shows how there was an interest and saw the importance of eyewitness material. He goes, the historian's strict principle of historiography were like those of Thucydides, something of an idol for later historians. Again, noting the importance of looking at this literature in its historical context. He writes, Papias belonged, roughly speaking, to the... And again, he makes that link in Eusebius, Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, verse 39, verse 9. Well, Papias is a very significant person in the origin of Christianity and in the Gospels. He figures very important. Eusebius, who quotes him, is not impressed by Papias. He thinks that Papias is substandard, and the reason is because there were different views on the end times, and those who followed the gospel, the Apostle John idea of end times, some of the early church fathers had problems with, and such as Eusebius. But Papias is important because we do get an understanding of how people were thinking about the Gospels. But again, I think you have to be careful. History can be fragmentary, and sometimes we don't have all the facts, so we have to hold things in tension. J.D. Dunn says, history, meaning, and eyewitnesses, he thinks it's collective memory. Just for a second. Just having a break just for a minute. I'm just going to play back the last bit there, just so I can follow my own thoughts. Belonged, roughly speaking, to the, and again he makes that link in Eusebius, Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 39 verse 9. But Papias is a very significant person in the origin of Christianity. He figures very important. Eusebius, who quotes him, is not impressed by Papias. He thinks that Papias is substandard, and the reason is because there are different views on the end times. And those who followed the gospel, the Apostle John idea of end times, some of the early church fathers have problems with, and such as Eusebius. So Papias is important because we do get an understanding of how people were thinking about the Gospels. But again, I think you have to be careful. History can be, sometimes we don't have all the facts, so we have to hold things in tension. Yeah, okay. So we have to hold things in tension. That is to say that when we're doing historiography, there are difficulties, and we get some clear lines of evidence, but we get lines of evidence that are not as clear or seem to be contradictory, and sometimes we have to hold that in tension. And so Papias is a wonderful example of information about the nature of how the Gospels might have been written, and excellent information about the Gospels, but at the same time, there are some difficult questions to answer as well concerning the nature of that evidence, and we have to be intellectually honest and recognize the challenges and struggles that we have as historians. On page 93, Richard Bauckham says in his book, the fall critics did not think much of the information which the ancient church provides concerning the concrete persons behind the Gospels, not even the personal retinues in the New Testament. The notion of creative community makes questions of concrete traditions uninteresting. This depersonal contagious effect right to the present, it still regularly happens that people blithely speak about products of the church and traditions which circulated in the communities instead of asking who has formulated or reformulated or transmitted a certain text. So what he's saying there is that there is this persistent, unfair way of looking at the historical material concerning the Gospels. There is this tacit desire to talk about generalities. Also a desire to undermine what the church is saying about certain individuals. So when the church is saying that Ignatius and Polycarp and Irenaeus are in how we understand how the Gospels came to us, the form critics and other critics will just dismiss that and to see that as not important, that they will have ideas about various communities that they think have shaped the Christian formulations. Often these ideas are based on nothing but supposition, nothing but vague thoughts that are not actually rooted in the apostolic tradition, or not rooted in how the actual history did take place, because there is not taken seriously the importance of individual key people who were managing that tradition. Page 95. That Jesus himself appointed 12 of his disciples for a special place in his mission of renewing and restoring God's people, Israel, has been doubted by some scholars following the lead of Rudolf Bultmann, who have supposed that the notion of the 12 originated only later. However, a large majority of recent scholars has accepted it, especially since it coheres so well with the trends to understand Jesus in thoroughly Jewish terms. Page 95. So what Richard Bauckham is doing here now is undergirding his idea of historical tradition, undergirding his idea that there were these specific key people managing the tradition, by showing that scholarly consensus has moved over to this kind of thinking. Page 95, he writes, the appointment of 12 constituted, several scholars have argued, a prophetic sign of what God was doing. He writes, it is not difficult to imagine that their role in the earliest Christian community would include that of authoritative transmissions of the sayings of Jesus and of the eyewitness of the events of Jesus' history. If any group in the early community was responsible for such a kind of formulation of structure of a body of Jesus tradition, then the 12 are as much the most obviously likely to have been that group. So again, he's putting the argument here that the Gospels were written by specific individual people, and why couldn't it? Could it not have been? Why could it not have been the 12 disciples? And then if that is the case, what in understanding our history of the Gospels? Just an interesting note, if we look at the Gospels and the grammar of the names, they're very similar to the archaeological evidence that we found in that area of Jerusalem, where in proportion to the population size of first century Judaism, exactly mirrors the four Gospels. In other words, how society was made up in first century Jerusalem, how that society was made up in its numbers and the names that it used, the people's names, because these people would die and we find their graves and what have you. So we know the kind of names that were being used of Jesus, and it directly agrees, the archaeological evidence agrees with the distribution of names in the Gospels in the same proportion is highlighted in the archaeological evidence as well. So the names of the Gospels correspond to the reality of the actual first century Jerusalem. Again, Bauckham goes on to do in-depth study on inclusion the way Greek historians and Roman historians wrote, using the inclusion as a demarcation of showing that there is eyewitness material. He uses that to show there is eyewitness material in the Gospel of Mark, for example, because the Greek and Roman historical method was used in the Gospels. So we come to our last quote, page 163. Studies of the point of view in Mark have missed the plural to singular narrative device characteristic through it. It is of Mark's Gospel. It is a form of internal focalization. What Borkham is saying is that the way the Gospels wrote, for example Mark, the way the grammar was written, there was internal focalization. That is to say, the language was produced in such a way as to indicate the eyewitness material within the text, just exactly how ancient historians of the time wrote. So we've come to the end of my notes on Richard Balcom, or Borkham. I say Richard Balcom. We've come to the end of my notes. My conclusion, what are my overall conclusions for me? Well, for me, this is just the beginning. I think I'm in a great big quest at the moment to read as much as I can, and it stimulated me to study more about history. I'm working through some historians at the moment, Herodotus, Polybius, Livy, and many others. And I want to understand history and how that history in ancient times impacted the writing of the Gospels. I think the other thing that I like about Borkham, and he reassesses them, and I think it shows that there has been a bias in the academic world concerning the four Gospels, because it used form criticism with such a straitjacket that it stopped scholars actually looking at evidences that was right under their noses. So I admire Balcom for doing that. I admire him that he you know, he's a scholar that thinks deeply and goes widely. I like the reassessment of Papias, how he reassesses that and gets new information, and how he uses that as a base to show there is probably eyewitness material in the Gospels purely from that piece of literature, purely from an analysis of Papias. I think it's very dangerous to take information like Papias and develop some argument without having wider evidences, and so it can be a bit too simplistic, and unless you're a specialist in the field, you wouldn't really appreciate that sometimes Barkham is a bit too simplistic. Having said that, you can't take away there is a nuanced sophistication within his writing, so I have to give him that as well. But I think the nature of historiography, you can sometimes slip into overgeneralization. I think that Barkham has done that sometimes. To me, I think there's more work to be done. I think there's more work to be done on ancient historiography and how that relates to the Gospels. And for me, I'll do that. His book gives you a lot of strength and help as a Christian in terms of defending your faith. But I think there are wider evidences as well that we have to consider. We have to consider not just Papias, but Irenaeus, Ignatius, Polycarp. We have to consider the Gnostic Gospels and critique them. And the book just is making a point that We're making a big mistake when we're looking at the Gospels. We should be looking and recognizing eyewitness material. I think if that's his intention, then his book has succeeded. So those are my thoughts. I think I would encourage you to read the book uh, and get back to me. So thank you for listening, and God bless you.